Welcome to the Pious Reflections podcast. I still say Solomon's Corner. I just need to say formerly known as Solomon's Corner. This is the Pious Reflections podcast. I am your host, Daniel Roberts. For those that do not know, we are going through the Rosary and the Sorrowful Mysteries, doing reflections on those. I am excited that you are here. And so today we are going to be talking about the Crucifixion. And this is just, I think, a pretty sick picture, actually. I think it's just pretty awesome. And that's what we're going to be going through today. So for today's reading that we chose for this episode is out of John 19:17, 18, and 40 through 42. So they took Jesus, and carrying the cross himself, he went out to what is called the place of the skull, in Hebrew, Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on either side, with Jesus in the middle. They took the body of Jesus and bound it with burial cloths, along with the spices according to the Jewish burial custom. And in the place where he had been crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb, in which no one had yet been buried. So they laid Jesus there because of the Jewish preparation day, for the tomb was close by. If this is your first time here, Protestant, Catholic, whatever, glad you're here. I'm Daniel Roberts, and this is Pious Reflections. All right. Well, welcome to the Pious Reflections podcast. Like I said, I'm your host, Daniel Roberts. So we have reached the end of the Sorrowful Mysteries, and I got to tell you, I'm very excited about this one. I love the Sorrowful Mysteries. I think they are just absolutely incredible. I think that they are the basis for, some of the greatest fiction out there. Like, when you really want a good story, if there's no sorrow in it, then it's not really realistic. And so the Sorrowful Mysteries show us, what it means to actually write the reality of human life without losing all hope, but how dark it can actually get, and how dark some of our stories should get. And so I just, because our stories are going to get dark at some point. Death is still a factor in life, and while it's been redeemed, it's still this great unknown, as Bishop Barron would say. So we've reached the end, and what I want to outline for us today is maybe a thought that you haven't realized was there, maybe because you don't have the philosophical background, but there's a really interesting intersection between the Garden of Eden, the Garden of Gethsemane, and the Garden of the Crucifixion, which most people forget about because, as we saw at the end, it looks like the crucifixion took place in a garden. But also the tomb where Christ was buried. And I think that this is just kind of I guess you'd call it a divine Easter egg. For those that don't know, Easter eggs is a colloquial term in gaming or computer software programming. It's not just video games, where the programmer, because he's in there and he knows that he's under the hood, he can add something to the code that doesn't actually affect the code, but if discovered, will actually reveal itself. And so I see this as kind of an Easter egg in history, that there is a relationship, and that Easter egg is this: there seems to be a correlation between Plato's cave that Socrates talks about, and the narrative of the cave, and the tomb in which Jesus is buried, and the garden and the themes that surround all that. So let's just start off by reading a little bit of this. The people have now, as we saw with Barabbas, the chosen people of God are now mocking the chosen one, right? St. Matthew's account of the crucifixion reads this: those passing by Jesus reviled Jesus, shaking their heads and saying, "You would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Save yourself if you are the Son of God, and come down from the cross. He saved others, he cannot save himself. So if he is the King of Israel, let him come down from the cross now, and we will believe in him. He trusted in God. Let him deliver him now if he wants him. For he said, I am the Son of God. Now, when we get into this passage, again, Protestants don't have the deuterocanonical books in their Bible, and they really miss out on some stuff here. And so hopefully you'll be benefited by this study here. But one commentary on Matthew from a Catholic perspective says that it appears that Matthew is retelling the account of the crucifixion in light of the Book of Wisdom in chapter 2. And so when we get into chapter 2, we see this. This is Wisdom 2:13, verses 16 through 18 and 20. And I just cut out some of the extra stuff because it's just more violent rhetoric around it that would be too long to read. So you can go read the full thing. The full passage would be 2:13 through 20. But these are people who hate the one who claims to be the Son of God. And they say, he professes to have knowledge of God and styles himself a child of the Lord. He judges us debased. He holds aloof from our paths as from things impure. He calls blessed the destiny of the righteous and boasts that God is his Father. Let us see whether his words be true. Let us find out what will happen to him in the end. For if the righteous one is the Son of God, God will help him and deliver him from the hand of his foes. Let us condemn him to a shameful death, for according to his own words, God will take care of him. And what do we see up here? Those passing by reviled him, shaking their heads and saying, you would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Save yourself if you are the Son of God, and come down from the cross. He saved others, he cannot save himself. So he is the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross now, and we will believe in him. He trusted in God. Let him deliver him now if he wants him. For he said, I am the Son of God. And so these are clearly related passages. And I bring this up because, this was a shocker to me as I came into the Catholic Church and started reading some of the deuterocanonical books, which, by the way, some of them are super long. And not just like small books. When you get into when you're being exposed to them for the first time, you're kind of thinking like, oh, well, maybe these are like little books, like the epistles or whatever. No, like one of them is, I think it might be Wisdom. I can't remember, but it's 50 or 60 chapters. I mean, it's about the size of Isaiah. I mean, there's a large chunk of scripture in there that just got ripped out. And you kind of got to wonder, like, why not just rip out certain sections as Protestants like they did with the book of Daniel? But anyway, so now we come to this passage that I want to kind of highlight because I don't want to spend too much time on wisdom. We spent more time on that in the scourging of the pillar. But here is a really interesting factor. When we look at John 19:41, it says this: Now in the place where he had been crucified, there was a garden. And hold on just a second. I'm on the wrong window there. Now, in the place where he had been crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden, a new tomb in which no one had yet been buried. Now, when we think of the garden, we may think of the Garden of Gethsemane, and that is a valid way to think about it. But there's another garden that may also come to mind, and that is the Garden of Eden. The place where Adam and Eve are first tempted is the garden. The place where Christ and his mother suffer is a garden. But then there's this extra little bit there. There's the tomb or cave in which Christ is laid. And for this analogy, I want to turn to some of the Greek thinkers. Well, not analogy, but for this tie-in, I guess you would say. Turn to some of these Greek thinkers who preceded Christ by about 350 years, depending on which scholar you read, I guess, and may have intellectually and culturally paved the way for Christ's ministry. And I actually, as an aside, I talked to a friend. This appears to be what's happened hermeneutically with the word of conscience being used in Paul's writings. There are certain words that translators have noticed actually do seem to relate to the ideas that are not in Hebrew thought but are in Greek thought and started in Plato and Aristotle. So there's at least this. It seems that God, in his divine wisdom, which basically is translation for God does things the way he wants to do them, and our job is to discover them. But not necessarily the way he had to do them. Okay, divine wisdom is God does things the way he desires them to be done, but not necessarily the way he had to do it, because he's God and he could have done it a myriad of ways. So in his famous dialogue known as Plato's Cave, Socrates is in a debate, and the authorship of the cave is probably Plato. Most definitely is Plato. It's in the completed works, but there's a question. Why I'm getting stumbled up here is there's a question over whether or not Socrates was a real person or not. I'm not going to dive into that. We're just going to assume that Socrates is a real person for this part of the reflection. But Socrates presents a story to one of his friends about reality, in which the characters are chained to a wall and they're in the darkness of a cave. And so Adam and Eve, they are in the garden, they're in paradise. And then on the other side, you have this, in the Greek thought, you have this cave where people are in this cave and they're in darkness and they only see shadows, and they don't have access to the truth. Now, behind these people in this cave is a torch with men holding it with cutouts of various animals and things that cast a shadow on the wall in front of them. Socrates then asks, well, what would happen if one of the men escaped and crawled out of the cave to discover the sun or the light of the world, and then could suddenly see the world as it was? He then asks, suppose this man actually went back into the cave in order to tell the other prisoners what would happen to them. And this is what he says. And I got this from there's a publication on Harvard University's website translated by Sean Eyre. And this is great. It's not very long either. It's only about 11 pages. It looks like double spaced. And so we read this. Socrates says, and so let's say he, the man who has escaped the cave, is with the captives and gets put into the position of interpreting the wall shadow. So he's already been out and in the world, and now he's coming back. His eyes are still adjusting to the darkness, and it may take a while before they are. Wouldn't he become a laughingstock? Wouldn't they say, you have returned from your adventure up there with ruined eyes? Would they not say that the ascent was a waste of time? And if they had the opportunity, do you suppose that they might raise their hands against him and kill this person who is trying to liberate them to a higher plane? Now, what's interesting about this is precisely what happens to Christ. John the Baptist says, in John's Gospel, Christ says in verse 3:19, the light came into the world and the darkness didn't want it and it hated it. And we'll talk about that passage in a second. But first, let's go back to the Garden of Eden. We see a similarity there. Adam and Eve are not prisoners in the garden like they are in the cave. They are in paradise. In the garden, there are two trees, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And a serpent, a symbol of deception, enters into the garden and tempts Eve, who then leads Adam astray. And then they are banished to the darkness. So in Adam and Eve's narrative, you've got paradise, you got the tree of life, and then darkness enters into the garden and deceives them, and therefore they're banished out. In the cave, they start off in the darkness with just a little bit of light and from a fire, and the person has to escape and go up into the cave on his own strength, and basically then comes back, and they both end up in a state of darkness, right? Adam and Eve are banished. The guy basically says, I need to go back and save these people, and then he's trapped and ultimately killed by his people. So in Plato's cave, once the man attempts to escape the darkness, he does so by seeking the light. But then when he enters back, his captors kill him. Now, in both of these situations, mere man has shown that he can be tempted to become God and he can be tempted to become the Savior. But in both situations, they ultimately lead to man's demise. Until one day, an angel, rather than a serpent, enters our world, the darkness, and offers the woman, Mary, the grace to become the mother of the Son of God, the light of the world. Now, Mary is immaculately conceived, so we know she's without sin, but the grace is still ultimately a gift from God that she would be the mother of God, aka Jesus. So earlier in John's Gospel, it says this, and this is the verdict, that the light came into the world, but people preferred darkness to light because their works were evil. So let's go back and read that quote from Socrates. Wouldn't he become a laughingstock if he came in to the captives and interpreting the wall shadows? Wouldn't they say, you have returned from your adventure up there with ruined eyes? Would they not say that the ascent was a waste of time? And if they had the opportunity, you suppose that they might raise their hands against him and kill this person who is trying to liberate them to a higher plane. So in this discussion, we see that there is at least a very clear parallel between just the rational thinking of the Greeks and what would happen if a man came and brought the light into the world. And then we see the gospel writers take the same theme in a way inspired by the Holy Spirit and say, yeah, we know who that man is. It's Jesus. Now, when we return to the scriptures, we find three major gardens now. All right, the text attests to the Garden of Eden in Genesis, the Garden of Gethsemane in the Gospels, and the Garden of the Crucifixion in John, which is also one of the Gospels. And there in the Gospel of John, we see that Christ is taken down from the cross and buried in a tomb. Just like in Socrates' story, the man goes back into the cave. And in St. Peter's first epistle, he writes this: "In it, Jesus also went to preach to the spirits in prison, who had once been disobedient while God patiently waited in the days of Noah during the building of the ark, in which a few persons, 8 in all, were saved through water." And so this passage is oftentimes the passage that is quoted. There's others out there that seem to be, require a little bit more cultural understanding. But this one is clearly the spirits imprisoned. And there's debates about what it is. But at the end of the day, the creed says, "And Christ descended into hell." And so there's a lot of debate over what that could mean. But the bottom line is that before Jesus goes up into heaven, he is buried. And the Apostles' Creed, the earliest creed, says he descended into hell. And there he conquers hell. In other words, he conquers not just the garden with his death and crucifixion, but with his burial, he goes and he conquers the cave. So when we read Plato's Cave, it's not to say that Jesus went into Plato's cave in the literal sense, meaning like, Socrates, there's a real cave, and the cave that Jesus actually was buried in was Plato's cave. Oh, my word. That's not what we're saying. But in the secondary or tertiary sense, meaning, this you're only going to benefit from this description. You're not going to you're not going to need this to understand the essential characteristics of the gospel, because these themes are already in the gospel with the Jews and the Gentile passages. But I just think this is really cool that even these kinds of, like I said, Easter eggs are woven throughout human history, and that we still have them, because we only have what we have because God feels it appropriate and fitting that we have the documents that we have. So after all, Plato's man entered the cave and was killed, and Christ entered the world of sin and darkness as the light. Plato's man went back into the cave to liberate the captives, and they killed him too. But Plato's man stayed dead, and Adam and Eve remained outside the garden. It is only Jesus, the King of the universe, who is capable of both entering the Garden of Eden and the cave of Socrates and conquering both. Now, the crucifixion is the epicenter of both human history and human suffering, which again shows that forms of Christianity that try to downplay suffering or try to act like suffering is just, something that we shouldn't really think about, are ultimately not preparing well for the suffering that is inevitable. If we are going to persevere in our suffering, we have to meditate on the sufferings of Christ, because those are the sufferings that make suffering in our lives meaningful. Like Paul says, he makes up for what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ. In the same way, the sufferings that we will have to endure, we want to be prepared to imitate Christ in those times. And so there's a lot we could talk about with the crucifixion. The idea that two perfect beings who walked the earth, Mary and Jesus, were the two people who suffered more than any other human beings on earth and in history. We also learn that from that if we imperfectly follow Christ, we ought to expect the world to revile us. Now, that doesn't mean that just because you're hated that you're right. That's not what that means at all. It means that the teaching of Christianity is clear if you're a Catholic. And what you start to realize, which I don't think you would be able to realize this outside of the Catholic Church, but once you come into the church, you do start to realize that, man, a lot of criticisms, like anti-Catholic criticisms, really, and those are people who want to go destroy statues and stuff and really have a hatred for Catholics. These are not the same people who will stand with Catholics outside of abortion clinics and pray together and do these things together to try and save the soul that they both see as valuable, which is a human child. They see them as men of goodwill, right? And Jesus says, if they're not for us, or if they're not against us, then they're for us. And so, at the end of the day, what we learn here is that, if the perfect man and perfect woman of the new covenant suffered more than anybody else, then we have to acknowledge that to follow Christ is going to ultimately lead to our suffering. And in order to have confidence that we are suffering for the right things, we need to be able to know what Christianity teaches. Otherwise, we will always have an excuse to not take a stand. We will always have an excuse. If Christianity fundamentally is not knowable, if the moral teachings of the Catholic Church are ultimately just arbitrary opinions and what the Baptists think over here and what the Methodists think over here, which, by the way, they say abortion is a necessary evil, if these are the things that we are going to say are kind of up to personal opinion, well, then, you can always say that you don't have to take a stand. You can always tell perpetual infelicity, saints from the early church who wouldn't burn incense, that was their personal choice, but I'm okay with burning the incense. So just as Christ was not alone in the garden, so he is not alone at the hour of his death. That's another thing we could have reflected on. God's going to give us the grace to endure whatever suffering as Christians we ultimately are called to endure. But as we close out the series, we remember that if we are to be Jesus' disciples, we too must, like Simon of Cyrene, take up a cross and follow Christ to Golgotha. It's interesting, in Luke's gospel, he says that Simon of Cyrene followed behind Jesus. And so as we approach Golgotha with our rosary in hand, which, by the way, this would mean that we're on the last bead right here. I forgot to bring this up for those that don't know what a rosary is. So we're right here. We're on the last one right there. So we started down here on this one. We went all the way around to this guy, to that guy, and then to this guy, and then we're done. And so we find a woman as we approach Golgotha, rosary in hand, cross on our back. We see a woman, and she's veiling her holiness and praying. And we realize it is Mary, our heavenly mother, God's most magnificent creature. And just as she was praying for Christ at the hour of his death, so we know, those of us who pray the rosary, that she will be present and praying for us at the hour of ours. I hope you had a great Thanksgiving. I'm Daniel Roberts. This is Pious Reflections. Keep praying.